Welcome back to Life Talks, and today we're going to continue a series of at least 2 episodes we're doing on the worship wars of the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and to some extent they're still around today. And just what that means, the implications for all of us as we kind of navigate culture within a religious context, a spiritual context. My name is Dan. I'm one of the teaching pastors at Life Fellowship in Charlotte, suburban Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm with our producer today, Josh Brahm. And Josh, man, you and I were taking a trip down memory lane talking about some of the things because we've been around. You 20 years behind me, but you experienced it as someone on one side of the pulpit, and I experienced it from somebody on the other side of the pulpit. As many churches divided over this. I also kind of contribute this to the rise of the modern megachurch movement.
Talk about that a little bit. That's interesting.
Well, it's interesting. We have more megachurches than ever in history right now. And the level of Christianity in America is less than it has ever been. So, in other words, the mega churches are not being filled with new converts. They're being filled with converts from other churches. We also have tons of empty churches, dying churches, struggling churches, many of them rural churches. And what has happened is the generation that was absolutely adamantly, we're not changing our music, as they have aged, they've died out. The younger generation who said, this does not relate to me, they went to the other churches.
Right.
Where they have more of a worship, and I hate this word, but it's what they use, a worship experience.
Yeah.
And so...
Why do you hate that word? That's interesting.
Because I think it's reductionist, first of all, and I also think it just doesn't encapsulate what worship should be about, because it's very it's my experience. And I don't think worship should be about my experience. I think it should be connecting with God and truth. And whether it gives me goosebumps or whether it makes me cry or whether it makes me think is not as relevant as is the truth being proclaimed and is the Lord being honored.
Definitely agree with that. So there's definitely a clear danger of people way over emphasizing the experience side of this.
I think when you use the word experience, you are verbally indicating that you have the wrong audience. That's how I put it. Oh,
that's interesting.
Yeah. It's not about the audience that's in the room. It's about the audience that's up above. I know that sounds almost pathetically pious, but I really believe that. I really believe that.
Yeah.
Which helps me in navigating the worship wars. And another thing that helped me, and Josh, you and I talked about this off camera, but traveling the world.
Yeah.
I was in a church recently, a couple of years ago, in Uganda with dirt floors in it. And they started dancing. Wow. Do you remember the old Snoopy movies and whatever? Yeah. And Pigpen, and there was one, I don't remember which one it was, but everybody was dancing in Pigpen, and then the dust started coming up and Pigpen. You always had a thing. But that's exactly what it was like. They were literally taking gallon jugs of water and pouring on the floor to cut the dust. And
but they were dancing.
They were getting down. And the other thing about churches in Africa is they love PA systems, and they do not believe that you're really worshiping, I think, unless the PA is so loud it distorts.
Really?
I was sitting next to a speaker with a migraine. I don't get migraines, but if I did, it would be at that level. And it's so funny.
The basic line is, if we're causing pain to the humans.
Yeah. But when and the other funny thing was, when I have white hair, and so when I left the room, it was red. I mean, it was really red. When I got in the shower that night, it was hilarious because it just because it was red clay. But I will tell you this: those people were focused, and it went on for like an hour and a half. Wow. And they were celebrating their faith. They were celebrating truth. They were celebrating the Lord. It was my style. You don't want to see this white boy dance,
right?
But it was worship. At India, it completely different. Vietnam, completely. Everywhere I go in the world, it's different. And I just happen to think that we Americans have developed a Western mentality that says our way is the only way that pleases God, and that's dangerous.
Yes. And just in all kinds of ways, we kind of, I think of ourselves as at least smarter than all of the other countries. Yeah. And I'm curious, what are the differences that you've noticed between like India versus Africa versus some of the other places doing worship there?
Well, in all honesty, there's variations between denominations. even.
Oh, no kidding.
And also the origin of the church, because I have been to many, many mission field churches that were started by Americans, and they're singing our songs in their words, and it sounds just like it. So what I love doing is going to churches that are nationally started, nationally run, and you get to experience their culture. And sometimes they will sing our songs because, the message is universal. But, I've been in Cuban churches where it sounds like you're in the United States church only in Spanish. And I've been in some that absolutely sound, and I love Cuban music anyway. And I mean, they got tambourines and they got instruments. I don't even know what they are. And they're celebrating and dancing.
Maybe that's the reason we're not moving enough, is we're not doing Cuban style worship music. That'll get people to move.
It really would. And, that was what I loved about my church. And so my church in Florida, we really fought this in the 90s. And I mean, big time. It was exhausting. We had a choir. They wore robes. We only used a piano and an organ when I got there. You didn't use priest teams. We didn't have wireless mics. They weren't even popular then. So during the 90s,
did have microphones.
We did have microphones.
There were microphones.
Yeah, with long cords on them.
Yes.
But over the 90s, a lot of that changed. Keyboards replaced pianos. You had instruments, a variety of instruments now available to you. In fact, for a period in the late 80s when the first keyboards came out, I was the keyboardist. And,
no kidding.
Yes, and so we were singing traditional hymns, which I can play pretty easily and comfortably. But then I was adding, I was experimenting and playing, probably very distracting.
I went through that phase too, trying to figure out what to do with keyboards.
And you're such a great keyboardist. And the other thing too is, like when you play for a gospel song, it sounds like you're playing a traditional organ. You make it sound like you're in an African American church, and I love it. And you get into it like that too. So.
Yes. But I'm also mimicking African American musicians. Also, to be fair, like a lot of the best when you're talking about like that rock organ, not the church organ kind of thing, but like that kind of bluesy B3 Hammond organ thing that I love to pull out on our bigger kind of songs, like. I am the best organ players I'm mimicking are all amazing African American, like blues or gospel organ guys, and I'm just ripping them off.
So we have to ask ourselves too: is we have to make sure that our cultural preferences don't turn into racial, problematic attitudes.
So talk about that. What is problematic versus like recognizing, like you and I have talked off mic about how different it is to go to a worship experience in a traditional black church versus a very white church like.
Well, I think we have to appreciate the culture, and so there was this thing in the early 2000s where somebody wrote this essay, and we always grab onto cliches and just beat them to death.
Yes.
So somebody called the American church the most segregated place in the planet. On Sunday mornings. Most segregated place on the planet is the American church on Sunday mornings. And so there's this huge movement to integrate our church. And so we started by hiring tokens. And by the way, I have an African American pastor who's pastor of a huge church in South Charlotte. He and I were talking about this one day, and he was laughing. He goes, yeah, you white churches, you'd hire a black guy and think that you were interracial, and we black churches would hire a white guy. Same reason, he said, and think that made us, somehow different. But the bottom line is, the African American church is different than the white church, and it's a community for them. It's a safe place for them. They appreciate it. It was funny. On Mother's Day, I went to a restaurant. I got right in. I was so shocked. I got in at 1:00 and I just walked right in, sat down. And I thought, this is really weird. I left an hour later at 2:00 and there was a line out the door and in the parking lot, but everybody in line was African American. And the reason is because their church services don't end at 11:30 and they don't walk out if they go long. An African American service can last 2 or 3 hours. And so they had all just got out of church with their mamas and they were all in line, which I found endearing as well. But and they dress differently. So for us to say, no, we've got to, it's like we have a bilingual philosophy, but we have a Spanish church. I find it difficult to listen for a long period of time with someone who's not a native English speaker. So I've got to assume that someone who's Spanish or Indian or would feel the same way. So why Why must we say to them
Yes.
or to our church at the same time in South Florida, because everybody was from somewhere else, we had 57 nationalities in our congregation, and I loved it. I loved it. But our music reflected that. We would have African music. We would have Hispanic music.
Right.
We would have Southern gospel music, and I would rather listen to just about any kind of music than Southern gospel. We still had some people that really, really like that.
Yeah.
For me, it was always about, is it preparing our hearts to receive the word?
Yes.
Is it helping us position ourselves?
Yes.
So let me ask you this, from your perspective.
Yeah.
Do you see any correlation between the music culture wars and so forth in churches and the church today? What is happening in the church? Did we lose something in the process? Have we gained things in the process? Was it an overreaction? Should we have fought it longer and still tried to find some common ground? Because in most cases, if you felt strongly, you went to a church that was like you. And that's why many churches are dying today as their membership ages and passes away. What are lessons we should have learned from this experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think I have struggled and still struggle with how to think about when people should and should not leave a church.
Yeah.
I think one of the first Life Talks podcasts I listened to was you and Ben talking about like 10 reasons why you don't like it when people leave churches. And I agreed with some of them, and some of them were like, I don't know if I fully agree. I think but I do agree that people leave too often and too quickly, and we don't treat it as much like a family as we ought to. So there's a lot of stuff that I really like there. And then kind of like you were saying regarding like African American churches, it is perfectly fine for people to have a strong preference towards a sort of music style that connects to them. Southern gospel is clearly not it for you. So like you probably shouldn't be at a place that's only doing Southern gospel.
But
like, that's okay.
But if I move to Arkansas or Southern Missouri or whatever, I'm also going to have to adapt to that culture as much as if I had moved to India or Africa. Yeah.
So there's kind of there's some balance between trying to let go of some of our preferences, but also not going too far. Like I remember, I think it's a common thing that we do anyway, of just taking like a good idea and taking it too far. I remember a conversation I had with an amazing sound guy at a mega church, but it was such a wise thing, and I'll never forget what he said. I was saying a cliche that I had heard so many Christians say. I was playing at this church, and worship people like me, we have a blessing and a curse, which is that we hear every mistake that's happening on stage, or at least certain level worship people hear every mistake on stage. And so I was repeating to him this kind of cliche about how hopefully one day I am going to be spiritually mature enough that I won't hear the mistakes, that I can just focus on God and like all this thing. And he looked at me, Henry, he just looked at me and was like, yeah, I don't think so. He said, I'm a really good sound guy, and God wired me with a gift and in such a way that I can hear when stuff doesn't sound right on stage, and that makes me serve his people better. It does mean that I'm always going to be annoyed when I'm not running the sound because I always can hear mixing problems, but I serve his people better. And he said, you're going to serve people better because you hear all the crazy problems, so that later than 30 years later, when I'm here with a little microphone in front of me to speak to the musicians in their ears, I can do that.
Yeah. That causes me so much conflict because I'm the same way, but not with the music, with other things.
So let's talk about that.
Yeah. And I believe that we always ought to strive to excellence.
Yes.
I think we should strive to perfection because God is perfect. That's be Christ-like.
Yes.
And I also don't, and I've heard this happen many times. Some people will excuse sloppiness in for pseudo-spiritual reasons.
Yes.
Well, their heart's good.
Right.
Well, their heart's good, but their voice stinks.
Right. They didn't practice.
And I sometimes feel bad for doing this, but I do it anyway. I've been in small country churches where the person will get up there and they'll say, before I start, can I ask you to pray for me?
Yeah.
I've been really busy this week, really haven't had time to prep, and I kind of got a cold. So, and then they hack a little bit, and then they go, and it sounds like somebody's running over a cat in slow motion. And I'm like, honey, if you can't sing, don't sing.
Right.
Right. There's nothing sacred about having somebody do a special music song. You know, we don't even do special music songs anymore in our church.
Like most Christians don't think of it like that. Like I had to learn that the hard way, because the first time that I was in a recording studio environment, I had some of my stuff cut because it wasn't good enough. And the sound engineer there he taught, is like, here's the thing. If it makes it better, it stays in. If it doesn't actually make it better, it's gone. And so we just kind of got used to that kind of like what sounds cold to a lot of people.
But at the same time, if I'm in a church in the hills of somewhere else, and there's only 50 people in the church, you know, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king.
Right.
So the guy that can actually carry a song, while he may not be able to, you know, turn the pages for somebody in a church of 10,000 people. And I think back to my home church. There are some people in my home church that should not be allowed a microphone on a big stage or whatever. But they blessed my heart because I knew their story. And I knew. So I think that's where it's really, really important that we try to remove the notion that everything begins and ends with our situation, our location, our context, our preferences.
A lot of when I end up debating worship stuff behind the scenes on, so it was probably like every Sunday. Like it was probably what the worship team was always. We're constantly thinking about this stuff and debating things among each other. I feel like maybe the most common thing I go back to is I just don't want us to distract. And this is so not original, but I love the idea of a worship team as a conduit of us just trying to point people somewhere, hopefully point them towards good, deeper theology than they know, and of course accurate, but give them, you know, whatever musical quote unquote experience that they need to kind of like hopefully get them focused on not the fight they had with their wife on the way here or the kids, like get them focused on beauty, on art that God made possible, and sing those things, but then not distract. And that is the line that I've struggled with my entire life, because it's very easy to distract, and what is distracting and what is just adding to it, I'm just constantly trying to figure, okay, at least some things are clearly distracting. Big, long guitar solos in the middle of a song, I'm sorry, I feel like that's distracting 9 times out of 10.
Well, so now you're bringing, I think we're going to go to a third episode because I got so many things.
Yep.
But
it's fine.
That's one of the things I really struggle with, even at our church. I often, the people leading, whether it's the musicians or so forth, there are pauses, there are breaks, there are, I know there's terms for it, there are runs, there are different bridges, that's the word I was looking for.
There you go.
I don't know where they are. And they can change from person to person, from you know, song to song. And so I'm always find myself like right at the, because we've all been in a church where all of a sudden somebody thinks it's time for me to come in, and they belt it out, and all of a sudden they realize, came in.
That we totally do fake out sometimes. We absolutely do that.
Yeah, and sometimes I look around and nobody's singing because they don't know the words, or they're not familiar with the tune, or they don't know. And that, if I have a criticism for where we've gotten into music in the church today, that's probably it. Because congregational singing should be congregational singing. I love special music, and I want to hear special music. And I want to hear the best soloists, but I find it difficult for both to happen at the same time because I'm not a professional. I can't do runs. And I don't know that a lot of discussion has been held over that issue.
When I was a worship leader for something 5 or 6-ish years at a really small church. And so there was a period of time where I was completely in charge, or for the most part, in charge of song selection. And I had really great meetings with my pastor of kind of getting on the same, but like, what is our philosophy of even things like how often do we introduce new songs? Because if you do new songs every single week, people are just constantly trying to keep up. And so it's kind of, for us, we had a pattern. We'll do 1 new song a month. So we're going to functionally teach 10 to 12 new songs a year, and we'll do them twice in a row row and then take a little break and then do them again, and that'll be us teaching this song. But then we're not going to do other new songs during that. We're going to stick to ones that they're familiar. There's always going to be a hymn. There's always going to be a few kind of like popular ones or ones that they know, and then we're going to stretch them a little bit. So there's just a lot of kind of thought that went into how often are we doing new songs? How hard are these songs melodically for not easy singers to pick up?
And that's where the typical song in a hymnal was easy to sing.
Yes.
And today they're not.
Yes. A lot of songs they're much more designed for the singer who wrote it to sound amazing on the recording.
And I hated this. I hated this when I was a pastor. I hate it to this day. People use, they have 7-11 music. They say the same 7 words 11 times. You've heard that, right?
Yeah.
But I will tell you, the other day I heard a worship song and the same phrase, and it wasn't even 7 words long, was used somewhere between 20 and 30 times.
What was it?
I'll have to look it up for you. But it was literally 20 to 30 times, and at some point I'm like, okay, I got the point, can we move on? Right.
I actually think so. I don't know if I should think this or not, and I know we're gonna have to wrap up, but I almost sometimes wonder if it's a little bit morally wrong to do songs that are too repetitive, because there is stuff in scripture about just not
vain
doing
repetitions,
vain repetition. And I'll never forget a moment. Here's a funny kind of light moment of recognizing this. Is I remember at a big church in California used to play. I sat down at this grand piano, and we had these lead sheets, which is sort of like a hybrid between sheet music and chord charts, is a little bit of both. But you have everything laid out there. And I look at the bottom of it was 10,000 Reasons. 10,000 Reasons by Matt Redman, was everyone's heard 10,000 times. And at the very bottom was chorus 11. And I was like, I just had a moment of like, hey, someone in some, production, I had to sit down at music notation software like Sibelius and actually had to type at the bottom of this, chorus 1. At some point, once we're in the double digits, isn't this enough times? Yeah. Like, this is enough.
And we made jokes when I was growing up because we never sang the third verse of a hymn. You say, and we'll sing the first, second, and fourth verse.
Right. Yeah.
Or if we did sing the third verse, they would say, we'll sing the first, second, and the third is the last. They would literally say that because it's like there was just a limit to how much you could do one song.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to get into where we're just sitting around critiquing. And I think our next episode, let's talk about lessons to learn, lessons to take away. But I also, and one of these times I need to bring Jason Lanier back in here because of all the worship pastors I've ever worked with, no one understands worship theology better than Jason. Yeah. And he literally reads great classic ancient books on the theology of worship. Yeah. Which is what makes, even if I don't like a song, I know that there is a theological thought process that has gone into the selection of it. And I think it's important that I not like a particular song every once in a while, so I can be reminded that it's not all about me.
Absolutely. So the real quick to tie a bow, the positive side of this idea of that, like, let's not do the vain repetition thing. On the other end, just like you kind of implied, there are hymns where people just do 10 verses and none of them were the same, and you never got a chance for your soul to just reflect on this thing. And I do need 4 or 5, 6 choruses sometimes from the inside out or something for me to get all the way there. And so I'm not against all repetition. Yeah. I just don't think about it be double digits.
Yeah. And the reality is that we all process information differently.
Yes.
And if we're going to be part of a body, we have to respect that. And we have to encourage people in that. So, man, Josh, I love talking to you about this, and we're going to talk about it one more time on our next episode of Life Talks. As always, thanks so much for joining us. Our time is up, but we thank you for yours. We'll see you next time at Life Talks.